Well, welcome everybody.
Well,
I'm Joe Noriel from the History Connection, and happy to see you all today. A big thank you to Valley Orchards. Thanks for having us out. It's always a pleasure to come out here and share the stories of World War II. Special thanks to John Merrill from Petaluma Community Access, who will be filming this. If anybody would like a copy of this presentation, just let myself or John know, and we'll make sure we get that for you. Veterans, thank you so much for your service. And I'll mention this particular presentation is the first of many. The Argus Courier is going to be doing a story on local veterans who served in the Pacific during World War II. So if any of you know of those gentlemen, please let me know, and we'll include them in the program. But on March 1st, we're going to have three Petaluma guys who served in the Pacific, and it'll be a panel discussion, and they'll be sharing their stories, so that should be fun. Now on to our distinguished guest. Edmund DuBois is a retired regular Army Brigadier General living in Sonoma, California. He has a Master of Science degree from the University of Chicago, a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois, and is a graduate of Army War College. Mr. DuBois comes from a military family. His father, a West Pointer, served 35 years in the regular Army, and his grandfather was wounded as a captain serving in the Philippine Insurrection. Earlier family members served in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. During World War II, Mr. DuBois served in the South Pacific, with time spent in Australia, New Caledonia, and Guadalcanal. He saw combat action in the Solomon Islands. He has tours through Paris and Germany, 3 command positions and assignments on the Army General Staff, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and with NATO. And if that's not enough, he's the author of 3 books: In the Name of the Church, A Lace Cap and Two Boys, and A Lesser Tale of the South Pacific, where the author recounts his experiences as a young officer during World War II. Please welcome Mr. DuBois.
Thank you, Joe. If any of you cannot hear me, raise your hand. I'll speak louder. I do not have a resounding voice. Welcome to Bone Dry, California. Let's hope nobody throws out a cigarette and starts us on fire. First, a couple of words about writing historical novels. You cannot write in a historical novel, you cannot write what cannot be. For example, in the first novel about France, I wanted to include a story about a rattlesnake. Then I learned there are no rattlesnakes in France or in Europe. I had to put in some other snake to keep the story in. And you cannot fiddle with any historical characters you put in your book. You have to be true to what history knows about them and what is said about them. Therefore, to make a book interesting, you often have to put in fictitious characters of your own, which you can then bounce up against the historical characters as long as you keep them correct with what history knows about them. Now, the first book is called In the Name of Church. The setting is France. The year is 1572. Let me paint you a picture of France in that year. The Catholics and the Protestants, which in France are called Huguenots, had been fighting sporadically bitter religious wars for about 10 years. But in 1572, a fragile peace existed. Meantime, there were witches and witchcraft everywhere, or at least so everybody thought, and they were dangerous in the extreme. Everybody was sure of that. Throughout Europe in that year and the years before and after, many witches were tortured to death. Many were burned at the stake. Most of them were women. Now, let me get to the story, and I'll talk about one historical event which is central to the story. I don't have time to talk about the whole history. The Queen Mother, the mother of King Charles IX, Catherine de Medici, decided to marry off her beautiful daughter, Princess Marguerite, also known throughout France very affectionately as La Reine Margot. She's going to marry him to King Henry of Navarre, a leader of the Protestant cause. Well, what Catherine had in mind was that the marriage would sort of solve all these problems, everybody would be harmonious. It did not turn out that way. Paris, Catholic Paris, was seething at the prospect of this marriage. Our La Reine Margot married to a Protestant, atrocious. The Duc de Guise had a particular interest in unsettling this marriage because he had had a love affair with Princess Marguerite. Now, Guise also had a grudge against Admiral Coligny. Coligny was the leader of the Protestant cause in France. So Guise decided to assassinate Coligny, but the assassination did not go off well, and Coligny was only wounded. So Queen Mother Catherine, King Charles IX, and the Duc de Guise put their heads together. Now, history does not tell us what actually transpired in that conference, but we know the attitudes of the people going into it, and we know the outcome. Well, in the story, I have Guise and Catherine saying that, with this bungled assassination, the Protestants are going to rise up and kill us, all the Catholics, and take over Paris. Now, in the meantime, Catherine had persuaded King Henry IX to invite all of the Protestant nobility to be his guests in the Louvre. So there were hundreds of these, and the Catholics were afraid they were going to take over. Well, so they decided, finally, they finally convinced King Charles, after he was quite reluctant, to say, kill them all. The signal was to be 3 rings of a church bell from the Church of Saint-Germain. When the bells rang, Coligny was killed. At the same time, the king's soldiers marched up and down the halls of the Louvre, routed out the Protestants with their wives and children and mistresses, and slaughtered them on the spot, hundreds of them. At the same time, the king's soldiers roamed around Paris and also gathered up all the Huguenots they could find and began to kill them. When Paris woke in the morning, the mob took over, and the infamous massacre of St. Bartholomew had begun. It lasted for a number of days in Paris. It spread to most of the rest of France. In the end, thousands were killed in Paris and tens of thousands throughout France. Now, in my plot, in the meantime, Madeline is my heroine, and she's a 22-year-old nobleman, and she becomes aware that a 16-year-old peasant girl has been a bishop, a Catholic bishop, is for some strange reason trying to get hold of the 60-year-old peasant. So she takes the little girl under her wing. Now, why the bishop was trying to do this, we do not know, but somehow it seems to be involved with witchcraft. Thereafter in the story, we follow the bishop and Madeline and Colette, the 16-year-old peasant girl, through France as they head for the royal wedding in Paris. And all the time, or frequently during this, the bishop is trying to get his hands on Colette, but never succeeds. In the end, I'll only say that my characters are very much involved in these traumatic events in Paris and elsewhere. And in the end, the bishop gets his comeuppance. So much about In the Name of Church. The next book I'll speak about is called A Lace Cap and Two Boys. It is my second novel, a historical novel, and it is a sequel to the first, in which my heroine is Lucienne. She is a granddaughter of the Madeleine in the first book. She and her two young sons are captured and held by the Indians. Now, Lucienne suffers greatly because she is the slave of a very mean-spirited squaw who makes life miserable for her and just terrible. Even worse, one of her sons, the 12-year-old son, is awarded to an Indian woman, to become the mother of the child and raise it. So for Madeleine, this is an extremely heart-rending situation. She watches, unable to do anything about it. Her son initially resents the Indian mother, then gradually accept her, and in the end also accept the ways of the Indians. So she's very upset about that. Okay, let me speak of one incident that happens in the book, which is rather important, and it's the reason that I began to write books, particularly this book. The captives are eventually rescued by a troop of Dutch soldiers. That story is well documented. We know much about it. We do not know much about what happened to the individuals who were captured and their children captive. So we can play with that in my story. Now there is another incident when finally most of them are captured, that is also well documented in history. There is also a story about that, which has been handed down from generation to generation to the present time, which tells of the same incident. And unfortunately, the historical record makes no mention of the particulars of that story. So historians, most of them, write it off as legend. But the story is too juicy, too fascinating for me to leave it out of the novel. And if I did, I would have all the DuBois in America down on my neck for omitting it. So I had a dilemma. So what I decided to do was to create an incident which could have happened, historically could have happened. I said that Lucienne inadvertently creates a major taboo. And that taboo is so egregious to the Indians that they can decide she be burned at the stake. Well, I won't go through the rest of the story because you'll have to read the book to find out exactly what happens. But in any case, she is rescued, her children are rescued, and I'm the 8th generation from the youngest of those, who was a toddler less than 2 years old. She had 3 boys captured with her. All right, so much about A Lace Cap and Two Boys. If you want to find out more about that, it's buy the book. The third book is A Lesser Tale of the South Pacific, and these are my reminiscences of my time in an artillery unit during World War II in the Pacific. Now, they say that anybody who's old enough to remember can recall what they were doing when Pearl Harbor happened. I do. I was playing soccer using an empty soft drink can up and down the hallway of a Bachelor officer quarters in Fort Monroe, Virginia. 2 weeks and 2 days later, I was on board the SS Kungsholm, a ship that had been commandeered when it was in New York when war broke out and hastily converted to be a troop ship. Now I'll say this about my story, my reminiscences. They're largely anecdotal. Nothing very traumatic happened to me as compared to other stories of the Pacific and Europe and elsewhere. You'll find much more interesting things than mine. There's no daring do. I was very fortunate. Now, when we started out,
just in case.
all right. Are you hearing me back there? All right. Okay. When we started out, we had no idea where we were going, but I happened to have a map of the world, and so on that map each night, our officers would get up the longitude and latitude from the ship's captain, and we would plot them. The first betting was we're going to Dakar, Africa, but then we veered to the southwest. Says no, we're going to the Panama Canal. We went through there, nobody got off. We sailed out in the Pacific. It's Bora Bora, then it's Samoa, then it's Fiji, but actually we ended up in Melbourne, Australia. From there, we did a quick combat loading of the entire convoy and sailed off to New Caledonia, our final destination. I was settled in Noumea. Very nice duty in New Caledonia. Noumea was like a mini Paris with, wine and two or three restaurants, very pleasant duty. And there I had, along with lots of others, a wartime romance. There's more to that story, but I won't go into it here. In time, though, our unit was sent up to Guadalcanal, where we just phased through there. The major fighting had terminated by then, onto the Russell Islands, and from there we staged into the New Georgia operation. My part in that was in the landing force for the island of Vanguna, the southernmost of the New Georgia Islands. The fighting there lasted 2 days. It was rather rough, but I was they finally chased what Japanese were still alive up in the hills. I was not a part of that fighting. My mission was anti-aircraft to protect the installation there in Vanguna. So our first duty was to clear an area out of dense jungle. We had to clear 600 feet by 600 feet. And a lot of these trees were tall mahogany trees. We ended up having very nice mahogany latrines from them. But our troops, most of them from Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, others from the northeast part of the U.S., country boys and city boys, they became lumberjacks. And they learned how to saw on these mahogany trees about 5 or 6 feet up from the ground, a notch into which they inserted a plank on which they could stand and saw the tree down with words of timber. One of those trees was a banyan tree, which was so immense it took days to finally get it out of the way. But that island was very quiet, and eventually we were sent up to Rendova, near Munda, where the bitter fighting was going on. No sooner had we landed on Rendova Island than they said, "Don't get off your ship, you're going to Vella La Vella." So we got back on and sailed off to Vella La Vella, which was the furthest advanced island at that time. When we landed on Vella La Vella, a Marine major got us our equipment off our ships as rapidly as possible. Then he said something which I took to be just sort of braggadocio, Marine talk. He said, in 5 days, the dive bombers will attack from that direction, and he pointed at 10:15 in the morning. Well, as I said, I didn't take much of this. But anyway, 5 days later, we were in position and ready. When we woke up that morning, the sea was covered with destroyers and cruisers, our own, cruising back and forth, and the sky filled with airplanes darting here and there. An LST pulled into a little cove, which was just a short distance away from our battery. An LST is one of these landing craft, big landing craft, not the small ones that transported us, a big one in which you carry very heavy equipment and lots of troops. It was unloading troops from New Zealand. Well, we were on guns tight, which means that now our armament is 90 millimeter guns. That's our major armament. We had radars to sense the aircraft. I also was equipped with 50 caliber machine guns, which are there to sort of protect us in case we had strafing attacks. But we were on guns tight, which means that we could not fire our guns until authorized to do so. The reason was we had lots of our aircraft up there, and if we just fired willy-nilly, we're liable to shoot down our own as well as the enemy. Well, here it was 10:30, and the Marines said it was going to happen at 10:15, so I said, well, everything's all right. All of a sudden, I heard the roar of an airplane. I heard explosions. I looked up, and I could see the wings of an airplane stretching from one side to the other, and on the wings was the rising sun of Japan. Well, that attack had succeeded. They had a direct hit on the LST. Later that afternoon, they came back with another attack from the other direction and also had a direct hit. So all hell was breaking loose. Now, as I said, we were on guns tight, so all we could do was just sit there and sort of observe things. But our machine guns were allowed to defend ourselves, and my machine gunners did. They engaged. About 4 days later, a native came by and said, I want to show you something. Well, they took us to an abandoned banana field, and there was the remains of a Japanese aircraft which had plowed into the ground. Now, nobody knows, no way to know, whether my 50 caliber machine gunners had shot them down or other gunners on board the LST. There's no way. But I credit my people with half a dive bomber kill. Okay, well, in time, that sector became quiet. There were lots of bogeys. Bogeys is what we call enemy aircraft that you pick up on your radar. We encountered lots of bogeys. None of them came within firing range, so things were quiet. Then my unit was in the Bougainville operation, the last of that particular campaign, and my last encounter with the Japanese, which was almost purely incidental, was I was returning from Bougainville, and I had bummed a ride on a B-25, and I'm sitting up there where the gunner, the bombardier would sit, where you have, visibility all around, and we're flying over, and I'm enjoying the landscape, it's sort of beautiful with the turquoise waters on the reefs and all that. And we're passing over the Shortland Islands, and I look out, and here I see bursts, and I hear bursts. I know it's anti-aircraft. Well, the pilot had forgotten that Shortland Islands were still in Japanese hands. So we veered away, and there was no problem. Now let me go back to a lace cap and two boys to cover something. The principal Indian tribes in the story are the Mohawk and the Lenape. The reason the Mohawk are in there, I mentioned that there was this rescue in which Edmund DuBois was rescued and all the story about that and so forth. Well, they did not rescue all of the captives, and among those not rescued was Lucienne and her two boys. So she is later captured by the Mohawks, After that, she's captured by the French. And so her turmoil goes on. Eventually she gets, and her children get out all right. Now the two principal Indian tribes are the Mohawk and the Lenape. The Mohawks are one of what is called the Iroquois Confederation, also called the Five Nations. The oral history of the Iroquois Confederation says that a man named Ianawatha, who you will recognize as the Hiawatha of Longfellow's epic tome about Hiawatha, and another man, in the year about early 1500s, we don't know exactly when, about the time that Jacques Cartier was sailing up the Lawrence and claiming that area for France. They convinced all the Five Nations, beginning on the Seneca and going through the Five Nations to the Mohawk and the East, to confederate together and not war, and they did. And that confederation lasted, it still is theoretically in existence. Now, I include elements of that story in the novel through a storyteller who recounts the tale of Ianawatha and this other man. The other tribe are the Lenapes. The further north element of the Lenapes was the Esopus tribe, which was the one involved when the warring against this frontier village, capture the Indians, and so forth. The Lenapes are notable because they are the only Indian tribe that has a recorded history. This recorded history exists as hieroglyphs cut into flat pieces of wood. These flat pieces, it's called the Walam Olam. And the Walam Olam goes back to the Lenape's version of their own Genesis, quite similar to ours as a matter of fact, and goes through all the battles they had over the years and their migrations, including the story that they were the first Indian tribe to get to the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore are called by the term the grandfather tribe. Now this Walam Olam, as I said, has their history. The very last item in this Walam Olam is just after the Lenapes spied the first European ships. And it says, "Friendly people in great ships, who are they?" That's the end of the Walam Olam. And as we know, the people eventually were not all that friendly. And they did find out who they are. Now let me conclude, I think I've talked long enough, about 4 brief observations, which are simply my own assessments, about the war in the Pacific. First of all, reading over these encounters many years later, I've been aware that how many of them were absolutely touch and go. One little minor thing, one way or the other, would have changed the outcomes considerably, which then would have impacted the whole history of that part of the war. Second, the Japanese many times would have a tactical victory and then not follow up in order to gain a strategic victory. Why that is, I don't know, because they are, very aggressive. They teach their soldiers to be go-go and their commanders. But for some reason, that seemed to happen time and again. They lost chances. Third, the heroic coast watchers, those men who remained in the Solomon Islands after the Japanese invaded, were very important to the outcome of the war. They reported when flights of aircraft were coming our way, when ships were coming our way, they reported that information, which gave us a heads up, a little head start to go ahead and take care of everything. My executive officer was privileged to get to know one of these Coast Watchers personally when I had to send him behind Japanese lines as reconnoitering for the invasion of New Georgia. That particular Coast Watcher was famous. He had, well, I'll just mention this about him. The Japanese never did find out where he was. They came close a few times, but he had the policy that anybody who was after him, nobody would get away. And he followed that to the letter. Many Japanese patrols and platoons were trying to find him, and some were close. But somehow, to the Japanese, they disappeared without a trace. Okay, my fourth observation is that the bloody battles at Munda in New Georgia, on Tarawa in the Pacific, over the Kokoda Trail in Papua New Guinea, convinced MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific Theater and Bull Halsey in the South Pacific Theater to stop trying to take these strongholds on directly, but to leapfrog over them. And of course that strategy worked beautifully, and we eventually won in the Pacific. Well, that's enough of me talking. Do you have any questions? Incidentally, after this, I will be available to, if anybody want to buy any of these books, and I will sign them for you. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Do you feel the Japanese would have surrendered without use of the atomic bomb?
They would what?
You had fought. You had recognized that Japan had fought fiercely. Would they have surrendered without the use of the atomic bomb?
I think what would have happened, and nobody really knows, is that the invasion would have started with millions in the invasion and millions in Japan defending, and would not have gone to a final conclusion, because I think by then, after uncountable losses on both sides, somebody would have said that's enough. That's just my thought. I have no idea. I personally think that the fact that we used the two atomic bombs shortcut the war, and it would have been absolutely horrible.
There must have been quite a bit of logistical action to get you to move from point to point in the missions that you had there. I mean, you mentioned you were here, you were there, over there, and it sounded kind of like just something you were there, but what are some of the details of you getting from Guadalcanal to the next island, and you got there, did you keep the same weaponry with you in the move, or separately?
Yes, we would, when we got up there into the Solomon Islands, our transporting was on what we call LCTs. I mentioned an LST. An LST is a much larger version of an LCT. So we were one battery, we only needed 2 LCTs. They traveled at about 10 knots, sitting ducks for any Japanese aircraft or submarine. We were lucky, nothing ever happened, but lots of others were killed. I mentioned one other incident that happened. I don't know what it illustrates, it's just anecdotal. On our way north from New Caledonia to Guadalcanal, we were in a convoy. It was pitch black, no moon, and we were going along, and we were told when we hit condition red, everybody has to go below. I did not. I violated orders. And I stayed up above there so I could hear the radio messages coming into the brig, where the captain hangs out. And it would say, bogey at 50,000 yards, such and such bearing. And then bogey coming closer and so forth. Well, the bogeys came in, and then there would be a message, on my mark, execute 90 degrees bearing to the right. Well, they didn't say right, they had said something else, Navy term for right. And so they said, mark. So the entire convoy swings over to the right. And then later, on my mark, somewhere to the left, in the entire convoy to the left. Well, they never did find us, these bogeys, but at some point, and my guess is it was somebody disobeyed an order, somebody started firing, tracers, and then the entire convoy burst up with tracers, going everywhere, lighting up the sky. It was like a 4th of July. And as I say, my guess is that somebody just got trigger happy and fired when they did not, and they did not need to. They never did find us.
So you would go to your destination where you're going into a beachhead, or did you have a kind of a port, a harbor type of thing, but to do your unloading and get your position?
Well, when we landed on Vanguna in the New Georgia campaign, it was just a beach, a plain beach, and there was nothing but jungle in front of us and sand on the beach. So we go in there with our LCT, the ramps come down, we get our guns and stuff off, we park among the trees, and then we start our lumberjack operation. In the meantime, infantry troops had landed before dawn, and they were on their way to the village where the Japanese had their unit, and that's where the fighting occurred. So I was, as I say, was not a part of that. I was very fortunate. When I, all the way over on the initial convoy out of New York, the convoy from Australia to New Caledonia up to Guadalcanal and so forth, I had a rather foolhardy, favorable look. Nothing was going to happen to me. I was a young lieutenant, and nothing is going to happen to me like young drivers driving their cars these days. I'm not sure my men felt that way, but and as it turned out, I was lucky.
I have two questions. Were you deployed after Pearl Harbor? In other words, were you in the Pacific before Pearl Harbor or after?
It was after. We were the first convoy, major convoy from the U.S. after Pearl Harbor, and it was a little over 1 month before that.
My second question is then, before Pearl Harbor happened, in your world, were there discussions, ruminations about the Japanese? What did you think they were going to do? Did you think they were going to declare war? If so, what did you think they were going to do? Were they going to attack in the Philippines? Or what were the discussions about, if there were any?
I really wasn't thinking about that. But about 6 months before Pearl Harbor, I was at Camp Stewart, Georgia, and I was in my father's unit. He was a full colonel, I was lieutenant. And he invited me up to his little cabin there on the post, and because he was about to go off on another assignment. He said, in 6 months, I'll be eating fish and rice. Well, again, I thought, that's talking nonsense. What he knew was that he was soon to be ordered to the Philippines. And he knew that the chances of a Japanese invasion were high, and he would be captured and eating fish heads and rice. Now, as it turned out, he was in Pearl about 2 or 3 days before Pearl Harbor happened. And he was on a small convoy that left Pearl Harbor, headed for the Philippines with him and other troops. Then Pearl Harbor broke out. The convoy in the middle of the ocean changed course and painted the ship in camouflage colors, which they had on board. So the people in Hawaii were quite aware of the possibility of a Japanese attack. The people in Hawaii. The rest of the U.S. wasn't even thinking about it. Now, as I say, they were diverted to Australia. My father was sent over from there to Dutch Indonesia, and where the Japanese invaded, and he was left there in the last airplane to leave Indonesia. He barely escaped. One of the rather fortunate coincidence of the war was I was able to meet him 3 times there in the Pacific during the war. First, when we landed there in Melbourne, he had just arrived from the Western Australia in the headquarters there, and so I was able to meet him there. The second time was when we were in the Russell Islands staging for the New Georgia campaign, and his unit, by then, he had been sent back to the States. He was bringing a unit into the Russell Islands to protect the Russell Islands. I met him there. The third time was about the time the Solomon campaign was ending. He was then island commander of Green Island, which was up there close to Rabaul, the stronghold of the Japanese. He was island commander, and I was able to bum a ride up there and see him. So just fortunately, I was able to see him 3 times. Very fortuitous. Any other questions?
Hey, your comments about having paint for camouflage paint.
Yeah.
You were saying that there was talk in Hawaii of attack. Do you have any more specifics on that?
Well, my father told me many years later that, and I don't know exactly how true this is, but I think it's probably basically true, that the troops there in Hawaii had been on alert for about a week. And that Sunday, they decided to stand down much of the alert because the troops were sort of getting worn out. So they did. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened. He also mentioned, and this is recorded historically, exactly, we don't know, but anyway, the story goes that 2 men were on this mammoth radar, which picked up the Japanese attack. And they were AWOL because they were supposed to be on KP. And they reported it, and the headquarters they reported it to thought that they were picking up a squadron of B-17s that were due into Hickam Airfield about the same time. So they did nothing. They did nothing. They had the report of aircraft reporting and did not do anything about it. How much that story is true, I don't know. I've heard it told in different versions a little bit differently, but anyway, that's the story he told me. Any other? All right. Let me just say that if any of you want books, I have box here, and I will sign them for you if you want them. If you don't have, they're $15 for the lace cap and 2 boys, and $50 for the name of church, $12.50 for the reminiscence of the South Pacific. If you don't have your money today, don't worry. I've got cards here with my address. You can mail me a check, or you can go on my website, which is also noted here, and pay through PayPal. So.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and please check out my website, www.historyconnection.net, for future programming. Thanks again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you for service.
Light.